everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Roundtable here at the Center for Post-Christendom Studies. Great to be together with you, and today we're really glad to welcome James Robertson. He's a professor of Christian history at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, and he has done a lot of thinking about sort of the evolution of Christianity in Canada, and not only in the way it relates to Canada, but I know that even people in other countries like the US or the UK can make connections and with some of the realities of how Christianity has changed and shifted and evolved in Canadian culture over the last many years. So it's great to have you here, James, and really just want to tap into some of the thinking you've been doing about sort of the way that religion has evolved in Canada over the years. So let's go back and let's talk about pre-Confederation, around 1867, when Canada was becoming a nation. What was happening religiously in those days?
Yeah, I think that's the big piece, because obviously that lays the groundwork for what's going to happen. And to me, the Confederation is a funny piece, because the churches were pretty quiet about it. It wasn't that big of a deal for them. After Confederation, they have definitely 100 years of what does it mean to be nation builders. But beforehand, George Rollock famously sort of talked about it and described it as a fragmented religious ethos. And other scholars have picked up on that, so everybody sort of tries to pick at that to see, is that just sort of one of those dominant narratives that needs to be reinvestigated? But he's right. Like it's in my own research, I have this sort of like at the beginning we have these two dynamics of power and rivalry. So power being obviously in 1700s, we have New France between Cartier and Champlain showing up and working, and fighting Huron and Iroquois, working with the indigenous people, setting up Quebec City, Montreal, the fur trade, whatever. And of course, with them come the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, and they have a lot of success. And of course, we have the Plains of Abraham when the British start to look at the New World, and they come and they take over, but still allow French Catholicism to maintain, because they've got the 13 colonies. So they'll take like Nova Scotia, they'll boot the Acadians out, and they'll hold Halifax. So they got their navy, but they've also got their 13 colonies, and then they allow the French Catholics to maintain their language and religion in present-day Quebec. So you've got a little bit, but for the most part, it's French, it's Catholic. And then of course you have those pesky rebels in those 13 colonies in the south just get up and shock of shocks actually beat the British Empire. And so for all those people who stayed loyal, they have to head north back into British territory, which is Quebec. But given that these are English-speaking variety of Protestants, either predominantly Church of England, but of course we have Church of Scotland, we have the official dissenters like Baptists or Methodists. They're coming up, and they don't really like living in a French Catholic world, given that they've just lost everything trying to be loyal to Britain. So, in 1791, it's great. The British government, turns Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada, and we'll leave Upper Canada for these English-speaking Protestants of a variety. So we have, coming into what will eventually become Ontario, is this wide collection, but like loosely under this Protestant umbrella. So of course, like we said, the Church of England is there, and it's at the beginning it's going to be the official established religious element, just like British culture. The House of Bishops, you got the religious aspect as a very important part of British culture. You have the Church of Scotland, because you have a lot of Scottish fighters in the American Revolution, so a lot of them are going to go up, and basically you and I we're in a platoon together, and with a bunch of other, and we've lost, we stayed loyal, but you're going to grab your family, I'm going to grab my family, we're going to go up together, and we'll start a town together, because we all know each other, and it's a good way to start like a little town. So we say in Ontario, we've got a lot of Scottish named towns, and so they'll have, Presbyterian, Gaelic-speaking Presbyterian ministers, not a lot, and most of them come from America. And then that's about it. And then over the next probably 20, 30 years, you have a lot of American people, because it turns out a republic's expensive. So they'll bring their own versions up, because the British Crown is giving them very cheap land for free, or cheap land for very cheap, and the taxes are low. So with that will come a whole bunch of American stuff, from Quakers to Mennonites to American Methodists. You got some English Methodists coming from the east. You got Lutherans, but a lot of them are German-speaking. Church of England, Church of Scotland, Baptists coming up, and it's under Protestantism. There's a lot of rivalry, and they're not getting along.
So there's a very, obviously in the early days there's fragmentation, but there's still this thick kind of Christian culture that's predominant throughout Canada, whether it's Catholicism in Quebec, Protestantism in other parts. So what about one of the things that sometimes you talked about, how there is the church particularly after Confederation, maybe play some role in empire building in early Canada. And how definite was the division between church and state? Where in the States that's huge, right?
Right.
But it seems to me that in early Canadian culture there was a little less division between the church and state than perhaps maybe in the States or in its evolution. Is that a fair thing to say? Or?
Yeah, I think it's pre-Confederation, but you're right with the sort of this new.
Because it's the British system. I mean,
it is the British system
a little bit, yeah.
But in the 1820s, you have John Strachan, a famous Church of England person, petitions the king for Upper Canada, King's College, first sort of higher institutional learning in Upper Canada. But he wants it all to have all Church of England faculty, because if you have a lot of Methodists in there, they're going to bring not Methodism he necessarily has a problem with, but American ideas. And so the House of Assembly petitions the king, saying that what he's saying is false. And in one of those sort of interesting, how do you become loyal and British in British North America? And what they actually say is like, you know what? If you really want faithful, Christian, loyal subjects, give us the freedom to choose our own faith. Let us be Baptist, let us be Methodist, whatever. So, but I think what they oversold is basically what they're looking at is separating church and state. Like, get rid of establishment, which sounds very American. And when they've already been accused of being a little bit too American, when you get that to the crown, they start like, whoop, 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 whoop. So you're right. So the first 19th century, I think there is a real concern about the church is an absolutely vital pillar of the state, and it remains so in British culture to this day. Obviously not so much, not at all in Canada.
Yeah.
So I think that's a fair assessment.
So now, one of the things I've heard you talk a little bit about is you talk about how in Canada the church was instead of being proactive, was often passive or reactive to what was. Talk a little bit about that. I think that's again an interesting piece that's maybe a little bit unique in how the church evolved in Canadian society.
Yeah, there's a couple pieces on that. One is if you look at something like Nova Scotia, especially during the American Revolution. They didn't join the 13 colonies, not because they were like, no, rebels, but basically the British government said, listen, we're not going to make you fight, and we're not going to raise taxes. And I'm like, all right. There's this sort of like institutionalized neutrality, like, well, let's see how this plays out. And I mean, again, I don't mean to overquote him, but I believe it's George Rollock that talked about this, but he does talk about the sort of like Canadians, as in this idea, are not as political. One, we don't have a system where we're electing somebody new every 4 years, gubernatorial candidates, so politics doesn't play quite the driving force in Canadian, and I think that's fair. That's a fair assessment for most of Canadian history. But any sort of, and this is broad strokes, obviously, but when you look at like big 19th century after Confederation ecumenical movements, what you're looking at is still this idea of rivalry and this competition, and a lot of it's based on the fact that the Canadian Railway gets built in the 1880s. So now we're dominion from sea to sea. This sort of idea is like we've always known that we're too few people over too much land, but the railway kind of answers that. And so you start to see, for example, within Methodism, and if you know anything about Canadian Methodism, it's a story of ongoing civil wars. Like they just fight each other for whatever. And that goes right back to pretty much the beginning. But what you'll see is they'll come together when it's about settling the clergy reserves. So when the government finally says in the 1850s, you know what, we're not going to give the Church of England, Church of Scotland all this money, but you have to prove that you're a denomination with Canada's best interest at heart, and then we're going to sell this stuff and you'll get a section of it. Well, that's a good motivator. But that's not because Methodists are like, you know what, we need to get together and just bring the Spirit of Christ. Like, if we can shake hands and hold it together for a couple of years, we're going to get some money. Same sort of thing happens with the railway. We need to get, if we're looking at Ontario, we need to get to BC. We got to get to Vancouver. We got to get to Victoria because they're isolated out there. And we got to get there before the Anglicans get there. And the Catholics are almost always there first. And so we got to get to places like Red River. We got to get to places like Fort Calgary. And the railway allows that to happen, but we need money, and so you'll start to see the disappearance of the smaller groups. Perfect examples like the Congregationalists. Really, they almost embodied the Canadian ethos in their theology, their polity, and whatnot. They just never had the money. They weren't able to. They were still being supported by London. So again, it becomes a sort of reactive thing to what the government's doing. Confederation, like you said, is really good because after Confederation, we're now like, okay, we're going to start building. And obviously, like 1867 is Quebec and Ontario, and then over the years, we spread out west. We get to the Maritimes. And last, but absolutely not least, Newfoundland, of course. So again, but that's a government policy. So that's what breeds a sort of increased ecumenical spirit, which is eventually going to give birth to the United Church of Canada in the early 20th century. But it's not necessarily, and again, this is broad strokes, not necessarily an inner church theological conviction of let's get together. It's more like we're going to lose our stake in the religious landscape if we don't start cooperating.
So you think churches were beginning to feel that sort of potential, this idea that we could lose ground, we're struggling maybe, and we can sort of see that if we don't stay on top of this, we're already, so that was already a reality for the church, even, what's that, early 1800s.
Yeah, we're still in the 1800s for sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, and right from the get-go, it's, like when you look at American Methodists coming up between, in 1805, you have American Methodists having the Hay revival, and that really bothers the Church of England. And they can parlay that into, this is a threat because it's very American. So this is, we're just on the other side of the Revolutionary War. So the officials are like, oh yes, is this insurrection? But for the Church of England, it really does become, I don't want to oversell it because obviously, like you said, it's the 1800s. So the worldview is Christian. Like this, you got to remember this before Darwin. This higher criticism is just in its infancy. Yeah. So the biblical worldview is a dominant worldview. So it's not that we're the church and we want all the power and the influence, which I think you can make an argument more for today. But it is, people will lose, like, we need to be here to communicate to these people how to understand the world and go forward, or else, I mean, it's an agrarian culture. We need God on our side. It's cold up here and you're dependent on the land, and you're up against you got a bunch of crazy warriors to the south of the Americans. Plague, famine, pestilence, war, those are all biblical signs of God's disfavor that you want to avoid. So I think there's a legitimate like in their worldview, it makes sense. Like if we allow bad theology in, it could damage the nation.
Yeah.
As much as damage the nation.
So there's that idea that the church really feels like we have to play a part in building this nation
for sure,
in a way that reflects a biblical Christian worldview, and yet they feel like it's always a contentious space for the church.
Right, and then the nation building thing, that's definitely a post-Confederation. Before that, it's much more competition with each other. And I mean, even Johnny MacDonald, he's famously quoted as saying, "I was born a British subject, I'll die a British subject." Right. He's the first prime minister. So it is still that idea of like, it's a colony, and Canadians don't have, the Canadian story is not a slower version of the American revolutionary spirit. Like they do it by fighting, we just sort of, that's not us. That really, and that became like a dominant trope that we really need to sort of, you got to ignore that and recognize that the struggles pre-Confederation and post-Confederation Canada faced was, how do we be a good British colony with our own stuff? So even Confederation is not, we're getting away from mom. It's okay, home rule makes the most sense, and we can handle a lot more stuff here. So it's not, that's a huge piece that sort of separates Canadian culture from American culture. It's not, we don't revolt in Parliament. Yeah. We were like, no, we're trying to figure out how to, we don't want to be American. I think that's definitely something that stayed within Canadians. And that's an important piece, I think.
So that's getting to some of the really early formation of Canada and sort of the way that religion was, Christian religion in particular, was playing this role in it. So let's kind of fast forward a bit into the 20th century, and as things are evolving there, and maybe quickly give us a sense of kind of how that unfolds, and then let's talk a little bit about the maybe where the watershed decade, the 1960s. So maybe in a thumbnail, how would you describe the first 50 years of the development or evolution of the church in Canada in the 20th century?
Sure, we'll do it very, very quickly. It's like anything where you talk about higher criticism, you'll see splits between those who believe that the traditional doctrines of Christianity are coming under threat based on understanding how the Scripture is revealed. But of course, it's also a very exciting time of medical advancements. There's almost a utopia. There's some theologies being espoused that humans are actually, they probably wouldn't use the word evolving, but we're getting to the place where we're actually be good enough for Christ to come back. So there's a different eschatology coming. But 2 world wars will quash that pretty quickly. So as soon as we get advanced, like in all of this medicine, what do? We figure out new and spectacular ways to kill each other on a scale hitherto unknown. So that really, you're like, oh yeah, no, we're still wretched. Things like the Scopes monkey trial in Canada, we have at McMaster, of course, we have the fundamentalist modernist debate. So this idea of these new ideas are threatening traditional Christianity. So in education, this is, again, gross broad strokes, but you get places like Victoria College, present-day University of Toronto, they'll have people who are much more conversant with biblical criticism and whatnot, and don't see it as a threat to Christianity, and actually that can help. Others that will, and you'll see them sort of go underground for a little bit, but you'll see a proliferation of Bible colleges in the prairies through the 1930s, which is saying something, because when you think about 1930s as depression, and you'll see tons of Bible colleges coming up there to make sure that good Christian teaching is part of it, because as goes the school, so goes the pulpit, so goes the soul of the nation. So that's the early 20th century, is that ongoing sort of Canadian development. Of course, we can't talk about this without 1925, the birth of the United Church of Canada. So we return to that. What's the official established Canadian church? Is the blending of Methodists, a large section of Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and some smaller denominations that didn't have the funds to go to C, but they join in the United Church, and that becomes, it becomes Canada's church. And I would argue is probably the most, to this day, most accurately reflects Canadian Christianity. Still the United Church of Canada. Take that for what you will. But of course they're going. And on the other side of the World War II, between the baby boom, the growth of the suburbs, the United Church comes into its zenith in the 1950s and early 1960s, which sets us up perfectly for, as you stated, the late 1960s, early 1970s were watershed.
So we're going to come back and talk more about that. I think that's a great sort of setup for where we've come from. And in our next segment, we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of how the 60s were such a transitional place in Canadian history, and what's next. Where does that leave us these days as the church in Canada? Thanks, James, for that. And we'll look forward to you joining us for our next segment.